For this story, we wanted to talk to the FDA about its policies and procedures. The agency did agree to talk to us on background where it wouldn't be quoted, but it repeatedly refused our requests for on-camera interviews.
While they were busy pressuring the Texas State Medical Board to try to revoke Dr. Brzezinski's medical license, they were even busier trying to revoke Dr. Brzezinski completely from society by trying to place him in prison. The FDA and Pharma quickly realized that if Dr. Brzezinski's discovery would be given a fair review process, not only would chemotherapy and radiation dwindle into obscurity, financially crippling the industry, but it would also mean that for the first time in history, all of that income would funnel away from Pharma and into the lap of one single scientist who holds the exclusive patent rights. Apparently, the FDA had not ruled out the possibility of this happening one day. On March 12, 1976, FDA Bureau of Drugs Director Richard Kraut states in the cancer letter, when anyone other than large institutions ask permission to conduct clinical trials, you want harsh regulations. Sometimes we say it is proper to hinder research. And once these guidelines were adopted, the FDA would consider itself bound by them. In 1982, Kraut states again, I never have and never will approve a new drug to an individual, but only to a large pharmaceutical firm with unlimited finances. And so, the fiercest fight in FDA history began.
Dr. Brzezinski's dealings with the FDA commenced in 1983. At that point, the FDA commenced a civil action to try to close the clinic and stop all patients from receiving the medicine.
Before the judge in this case had announced her ruling, the FDA sent her a letter warning her in advance, if this court declines to grant the injunction sought by the government, thus permitting continued manufacture and distribution of anti-neoplastones, the government would then be obliged to pursue other less efficient remedies, such as actions for seizure, also known as raiding his clinic and home, and condemnation of the drugs, also known as a propaganda campaign, or criminal prosecution of individuals, also known as throwing Dr. Brzezinski in prison. Regardless of these threats from the FDA,
the judge in the case basically said that he can treat anybody he wants in Texas, but he can't ship his medicine in interstate commerce. The FDA viewed that as a failure and told Dr. Brzezinski's his attorneys at the time, that they have other ways to get him. Let's talk about the other ways. In 1985, the FDA convened a grand jury to hear evidence to try to indict Dr. Brzezinski. In connection with that, they had a raid of his clinic where they seized 200,000 pieces of paper, including all of his medical records of all patients. A little difficult to practice medicine when you don't have medical records.
Obviously, they came out and they confiscated all of our medical records. And it took us about 12 years or 14 years to recover these medical records. In the meantime, we are permitted to make copies of the medical records in their office, but it was also the neglect of human well-being. We are taking very sick people. They took medical records, and we needed these medical records to really fight for the lives of these patients, but they took this away. They didn't care for these patients. The patients could die. They were not important.
They presented the evidence to the grand jury, no indictment. 1986, they come back, seize another 100,000 documents, no indictment. 1990, another grand jury, either the second or the third. They present more documents. Dr. Brzezinski testifies extensively before the grand jury, no indictment. 1991 to 1993. FDA investigates Dr. Brzezinski. We don't know if evidence was presented to another grand jury. 1994, another grand jury, no indictment. 1995, another grand jury. This grand jury started in March of this year. On March 25th, I believe, it was Dr. Brzezinski, along with a few of his patients, appeared on CBS show This Morning.
Let me play devil's advocate. Here you all, very desperate folk, had undergone some cancer treatment, correct?
No.
None at all for you?
I
None
had
at all
no
for you?
treatment.
Let me go after these guys then first. Had undergone some treatment. Could it not have been that the treatment that you received prior to Dr. Brzezinski's treatment was what, in fact, really cured you?
Well, I'll jump on that. No way, because the recurrence I had was in a brand new spot that had not been involved before. So if all the punishment that I went through for the year went out of my system, and after it went out of my system, all of a sudden a new tumor comes in, how could that first treatment have helped the subsequent tumor?
Later that day, the FDA came, another raid, more patient documents, more subpoenas.
We were flooded with calls last Friday with people wanting to know how to get a hold of you. They're going to see this story this morning, see that you've been rated by the FDA, and they're going to want to know if you're for real or if the concerns of the FDA may have something to do with your treatments and the viability of your treatments.
Well, I don't think, let me jump in here, I don't think there's really an issue, as I mentioned, regarding the safety of the drug, and the FDA isn't contending at this point that the drug doesn't work. The only issue is that according to the FDA, it has not been proven by controlled clinical trials. So at least in terms of safety, the FDA isn't saying that it's not safe, and the FDA isn't even saying that it doesn't work. Right now, they're just contesting, or apparently they're contesting, whether Dr. Brzezinski himself has been shipping the medicine out of state, which in some respects is quite ridiculous since he has approval to ship the medicine out of state to various cancer institutions around the country. He ships it out of the country to various countries because it's being used in other places, and he ships it to individuals who have been granted permission by the FDA to receive the medicine under what's called a compassionate use INDs.
Okay.
May, June, and July, more witnesses testified before the grand jury, more documents. So we've had now 4, 5, or 6 grand juries. Let me talk about the subpoena practices. Most recently, the FDA has now subpoenaed the medical records of every patient who has gone on TV and told their story about Dr. Brzezinski. We'll let the committee judge what they think of that. We talk about dissemination of false information by the FDA. 1985, FDA tells anyone who calls and inquiring about Dr. Brzezinski that he's being criminally investigated. When the judge on the case found out about that, he issued a cease and desist and a strong reprimand against that. The FDA now has refined this tactic. Instead of waiting for people to call up the FDA, what they've done is subpoena all the records from Dr. Brzezinski about his business associates and all the researchers around the world, and there are many of them who are researching anti-neoplastons, his therapy. Now what they're doing is systematically contacting everyone who does business with him, who may do business with him, and telling about the grand jury investigation and subpoenaing documents. I believe that they're doing this in order to make the FDA, to make it more difficult for him to do business. I'd like the following questions to be asked the FDA. How much money have they spent in the last 10 years to try to put Dr. Brzezinski out of business? How many documents can they subpoena, and how many more grand juries does he have to go to? And why can't patients who have advanced cancer seek the medical treatment of their choice?
Upon the commencement of the FDA's 1995 grand jury against Dr. Brzezinski, an oversight and investigation subcommittee was organized by Congressman Joe Barton in an attempt to intervene in the FDA's relentless harassment of Dr. Brzezinski and his patients.
In my opinion, you have every right to use the investigative authority and the judicial resources of the federal government through the Justice Department to convene a grand jury. That's very appropriate. The first time, perhaps even the second time. It becomes questionable the third time, the fourth time, and the fifth time. It is not, I think, an unlogical conclusion to think that the FDA has a vendetta against Dr. Brzezinski or wants to retaliate for some reason. Now, that's my opinion. How many grand jury investigations have to occur that result in no finding of fault before you, as commissioner of the FDA, would encourage those within your organization to cease and desist?
Mr. Chairman, how do you know that there were no findings of fault that were returned from that grand jury?
There have been no indictments returned.
Mr. Chairman, I ask counsel to comment, but I don't think those are the same. As a matter of law, those are the same things.
I'm baffled by the splitting of hairs here, but
I'm just trying to understand the exchange between the witness and the chairman. What I understood the chairman to say is that there have been 4 grand juries convened?
at least 4.
I just am left then with a rather strong inference that if you convene 4 separate grand juries and there's no indictment returned, notwithstanding the prosecutors tell us always that it's possible to indict a ham sandwich, that probably there's not much there.
Dozens of Dr. Brzezinski's patients who had traveled to Washington, D.C. from all corners of the United States stood up and expressed their outrage with the FDA and Commissioner David Kessler.
The FDA has made a list and decided who can live and who will die. I guess I didn't make that list.
I've had no chemotherapy. I've had no radiation. I chose Dr. Brzezinski instead after a lot of research and a lot of searching. I've been in remission since 1989. Dr. Kessler, I'm not a statistic.
We're frustrated. Their rights, constitutional rights, have been violated. This has got to end. My children are asking me, Daddy, what does the future hold? My one daughter wrote a letter to the president of this country and said, please don't pull the plug on my daddy. And that just broke my heart and broke my wife's heart.
My husband is a walking miracle. 16 months ago, the doctors told us there's nothing else they can do, and they told us to enjoy what little life he had left. Look at him. He biked 32 miles after being on Dr. Brzezinski's treatment for 2 months, and they're saying we can't have it? I have a report from my family physician which tells how well I am doing. My tumors are leaving my body, and my condition is improving every day. Now the FDA is saying to me, no, your doctor is a criminal, he should be put in jail, and he needs to be shut down. This is criminal. I want the FDA to get out of our lives and stay out of her doctor-patient relationship.
What the classical conventional medicine had to do for me was there, nothing. For me, the next thing was the minister. I did not want to undergo chemotherapy, which I had a new name for, chemotherapy, or any type of radiation. I was extremely lucky I found Dr. Brzezinski. And I don't want the FDA to take this right from me. I came 18 years ago from communist Romania, and the tyrannous dictator Ceausescu never stopped a doctor from treating anybody. How can we have something like this in the United States?